welcome to How I Got Here, the inside stories of startups and innovation in travel and transportation, with your hosts, PhocusWire's Kevin May and Mozio's David Litwak.
Hello there, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to another episode of How I Got Here. This is PhocusWire and Mozio's regular podcast about travel and transportation startups. So today, we're here with Aaron Gowell from SilverRail Technologies. As many of you know, SilverRail was created in 2009 and a couple of years ago sold to the Expedia Group. So he's got a lot of things that he can share with us with regards to starting a company, building a company, and then selling the company. So we'll get to that in a minute. SilverRail here in 2019 is based in the UK. It has offices back over in the US where Aaron is from, Sweden and Australia. And primarily the company was founded to develop ticketing and distribution technology in the rail sector. No mean feat to have done that, and here you are. So thanks for being with us, Aaron. I understand that according to your LinkedIn, because that's what we always do before we start these, we go and look at people on there. You're also known as the chief conductor. Is that correct?
Yeah, I am. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on the podcast. It's always fun to talk travel tech with you guys, so I'm happy to do it. It actually started off as a joke because it's one of my board members in the early days started calling me. It just kind of stuck, and then it ended up on the business card. So I'm still sticking with it.
Okay, so as the chief conductor, the CEO, we'll call you whatever we like, I guess. You just give us, before we dive in, we've got loads of things that we'd love to talk to you about today, Aaron. But just give us your kind of 2-minute intro as to how this particular business came about in the lead up to 2009.
Yeah, okay. So this is my third travel business that I've built. First one was in 99, and we can obviously go back and talk through that. But like anything, like why do you get into something? It's often an evolution. And so I've been in the travel side, in the tech side since 2000 on the tech side, but in travel for a bit longer than that. And my last business was called National Leisure Group. And NLG built the very first online booking engines for the cruise industry and for dynamic vacation packaging. It was a really, really good business, B2B company that powered Expedia, Travelocity, Orbitz, Priceline, a bunch of others. And so anyway, what I was fascinated by was if you think back to the early days of the web, you had Expedia going public, being spun out of Microsoft, and Travelocity going public, being spun out of Sabre, both in kind of the tail end of 99, early 2000. And they were mostly just focused on air tickets and a little bit of hotel. And no one was selling vacations or cruises. And I was really interested by these other smaller verticals that weren't really being addressed. And if you dig into the underlying problem, it was mostly around technology and supplier relationships. And so we ended up building a couple of these big engines that are still used in lots of places around the world. And that company went from 0 to a couple thousand employees over a couple of years. Fast forward, after we sold that business, I was looking around again and thinking, well, what else hasn't been done? I really liked doing things that other people weren't doing. And if you look writ large on the rail space, you talked about a $300 billion market with kind of two massive trends, which I found super fascinating. One is the underlying technology was changing. And that's very rare in the travel space, right? A plane is a plane is a plane and has been for 50 years. A hotel room's the same thing as it's been. It's just, what maybe looks nicer these days. But in rail, you were seeing high-speed trains, which were coming in doing 200, 250 miles an hour, and they were replacing air travel. And it's very rare that you get to see underlying technology change like that. And I found that particularly fascinating, along with the behavior side. So when you see human behavior and technology, it's that combination that made it so interesting to me. And on the behavior side, it had a lot to do with sort of the push to the green movement, as we often call rail is the new veganism. There's just such a strong push away from CO2 creating modes of travel, a rail is 1/10 as much as an airplane and about 1/4 as much as a gas-powered car in CO2 emissions per passenger mile. And that's driven about 7% CAGR growth in the rail industry, which makes it the highest growing sector in the travel space by, probably 2 to 3 times. And I found those two things, that behavior of human and technology, really fascinating. And there was just nobody doing this stuff. So that was the genesis for where the idea came from back in early 2009.
So David here, there's been a lot of attempts at trying to aggregate rail over the last decade plus, and obviously there's a few other people who have tried this. I'm curious, kind of, what was the secret that you kind of saw and your unique perspective on it that all the other guys didn't see? Kind of, what was your secret sauce?
I raised more money. No, in part it is about capital and can you weather time. I think there's an element of truth to that. But on a more serious note, I think the fundamental difference of an angle that we took, if you think about the big global distribution companies, people like Amadeus and Sabre, who were really good at air and hotel and these other things, no one had figured out really how to aggregate up the rail space particularly well. In particular, because there are no standards in the rail space, so therefore no one had built essentially a single platform for rail. So Amadeus has lots of connections to all the different rail lines, and they move a lot of tickets, but it's a connection to the UK system, a connection to the French system, and they can sell it in France. There's no way to sell that French ticket in Germany, in America, to a customer who's up in Canada who's flying over. So, and it has to do with these individual connections and the lack of standards. So the air industry, these guys got together way early and said, you know what, if I'm going to fly my Lufthansa plane into Heathrow and you're going to fly your American Airlines plane into Heathrow, we ought to agree that in our systems, we're going to call Heathrow the same thing. So they created a group called IATA, and IATA calls it LHR for Heathrow. And so once you have data that you can, basically normalize across these things, then you can actually connect up long trips, right? The rail industry just never, ever, ever did that. They are not essentially commercial for-profit entities. These are big systems where they have huge social missions, right? And in fact, if you look at Europe, these guys didn't really want their rail lines to work together. If you look at, old pictures from World War II, a lot of the ways that the Germans invaded the other countries was through railways. I mean, these were major military assets. And the last thing you want your French railway to do is work with the German railway. And that's why you now, if you're on that rail line and you hit the border, the train goes dark for a second as it switches from AC current to DC current. And they have deliberately designed these things not to be compatible. So if that's your intellectual background for how you're approaching something, if you take, say, St. Pancras Station here in London, which is a really big one, there are technically 5 rail lines that have that station in their system, but they all call it by different codes. And if you're all calling it by a different code, it means you can never really create interoperability. So it's a long-winded way to say, because of the lack of standards, there was no single system out there. There was no global distribution system. And in fact, when I had this idea, I called Daro Khosrowshahi at Expedia. Previous to his role as Expedia CEO, he had been running IAC's deal group, and they had invested in NLG. They were one of our key investors, and they were a great supporter. So I called up Daro because I knew him really well. And I said, hey, I'm thinking of this idea. He goes, this has been in our top 10 list of problems to solve for a long time. He goes, but there's no technology company to tap into out there. He's like, it's not our job to go creating connections to the Germans, to the French, to the other people. We need to tie into a single platform where the data's been normalized. And so that was the momentum of what we did to build something different. We essentially built what, I jokingly call it the Rosetta Stone. It's a middleware layer that sits up on top of all the rail lines and reinterprets all of their information into the exact same data in the exact same format. So, Expedia ties into us one time. They can, they're looking at German rail, French rail, Italian rail, and it all looks and acts exactly the same way. So that was the big thing that we did differently. I think the second thing that we did differently was we had a lot of empathy for the rail carriers. And I think this is a really critical point. You know, if you look at the GDS showed up to the rail lines and said, look, we move lots of people. You need to pay us a ton of money, and then we will connect to you and sell your tickets. And the rail lines did that for a long time, paid those guys a fortune. But those companies, neither Sabre nor Amadeus, ever really built any new technology to help these guys distribute better, process data better. And we did. You know, we were very focused on, okay, the way to really succeed here is to make sure we're actually really helping these rail carriers out. So we started building super fast search engines that are designed just for the rail space with patented algorithms that you know, we've invested a lot of capital in. Door-to-door journey planning, because, you know, rail's not just about the chunk in the middle, but it's first mile, last mile stuff. We've invested heavily in building better inventory systems for the rail carriers. And our view was, yeah, you can have a good distribution business, but your distribution's only ever as good as the underlying technologies. So we also got into the carrier IT side, and have made a lot of investments there. But it is about the empathy and, you know, making sure that you're really seen as a friend to the rail carriers, a real partner. So those were the two big pieces: a unique distribution platform and relationships and empathy with the carriers.
Wow. So, I mean, it sounds like you're kind of almost characterizing a lot of these GDSs as rent seeking, if I can define that as, like, they're kind of, you know, say, well, we're big, we can extract a couple dollars from you per reservation, but we're not going to do much. We're just going to sit here on that and collect it. And your big kind of insight here was that if you just are actively innovating, you're already way ahead of these traditional guys. Would that be a fair characterization?
Yeah, it is a fair characterization. I mean, I remember a specific story from the UK Rail Carrier Authority. When we first met with them, they're like, look, we don't see a lot of value in what what distributors really bring to us. And I was like, well, what do you mean by that? He goes, well, you know, Sabre charges us $1 million a year to connect to us. That's what they charge us, flat fee. And then there are fees up on top of that. And I was just like, holy smokes, you know, you're paying them $1 million a year, but you're not seeing a lot of value out of that. That's a pretty heavy-handed approach. And for a small company, you know, we don't have the P&L to have a heavy-handed approach. We had to be very creative and flexible and, you know, have a fair amount of empathy for these guys.
Tell me, Aaron, I mean, given what you've just said about the way that, I guess, that business model was being structured between that association and the GDS, how did you approach your own business model about how you were going to make money in those early days? I know you said before, you know, you raised a lot of money, but how did you figure out, as you know, as a startup, as it were, how you were going to make money and how you were going to reinvest and when you were going to raise and things like that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because, to be honest, we didn't figure it out in the early days. You know, one of the reasons
classic startup.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, you know, frankly, we were naive about this space. We had no idea how it really worked, and we just thought, well, we've done this before in other places, maybe we can do it here. But sometimes when you're naive, you just keep going, and because you don't know any better, and sooner or later you figure it out. And that's exactly what happened for us. You know, in the early days, we really thought that we were going to be able to essentially act like a GDS and charge the supplier some small fee and then charge the retailer some fee. And we thought we were going to pull out, you know, maybe $4 a transaction. That's not even close to the reality. It turns out that in many of these European countries, the suppliers actually pay zero for any distribution. They're like, why should I pay some third party? I have a big website. I own all these customers. It's my rail line. I'll sell all these tickets. And it's taken a long time to get some carriers to recognize that distribution can actually be a good thing. And so the money in rail distribution is just tiny. It's razor thin. And so that led us to start thinking about, well, okay, where is there money in the rail space? And a lot of it, frankly, is in the IT side. You know, so we have a search business, as an example, where we build custom search for the rail carriers. You know, that's a double-digit million a year revenue business now, because suppliers view spending money on IT as a thing that they would do anyway, right? And you somehow view that very differently than you do a third-party distributor. You know, a lot of these guys pay IBM a ton of money, or whoever it might be, to build their systems. And so we started focusing there, and that's really what I would call created the stable base for our business. And we also acquired a couple of companies along the way. But in particular, we started to focus on these IT platforms for the rail carriers, because these tend to be long-term, deep partnerships, you know, 10-year contracts, that kind of thing. And generally recurring revenue once you've built the platform. So we focused heavily on that for a couple of years, because we realized the GDS thing was just going to take time. And most of the weight in our business is on sort of the search technologies, the carrier IT technologies. And the smallest piece is the original idea of the global distribution platform. But that's still the area that, in some senses, has the highest growth potential, because I still believe that if you get rail up inside of every online travel agency in the world, that you can transform the way distribution works now. I mean, it blows me away that, you know, the largest agencies in the world have just never sold rail tickets.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, you look in Europe, and I just saw the stat out of train lines about to go public in an IPO. I saw one of the stats in their prospectus that said their average user, and they're a huge business, their average user interacts with their app 21 times per year on average, which means obviously a bunch of people are using it a lot more than that. You know, you just have such a high.
That's probably 19 times more than your average OTA gets usage on their app. Right?
No, it absolutely is. And I think that this is actually fundamentally one of the areas where the OTAs have really missed the boat. You've got people interacting 20 plus times a year on a mobile app, yet a big OTA has to, you know, their average transactions are what, 3 per year? Yeah. So it means between every transaction, you've got 4 months of time that you have to fill with advertising money. That's why you're seeing big ad spend on Google, big ad spend on TV. And yet there are other ways that they could be getting in front of people with their brands in a much more frequent format around mobile and rail. And so I really think you're going to start to see people wake up to that. Obviously, you know, as part of Expedia, this is part of their strategy over time. So, you know,
I mean, it's interesting. Sorry to butt in there. I mean, it sounds like you went through a fair amount of almost like an educating process, one for your operators and two for the OTA partners that you worked with. And perhaps at some point there will be some educating needed from OTAs to consumers that, oh, hey, you can buy a rail ticket on us.
Absolutely.
Was that a difficult process, all that educating, almost tiring?
It is. It takes time. You know, I remember this this article really resonated with me for a long time. There was an article talking about the difference between fixing a business and disrupting. Uber is a disruptive business. There were people in another industry, taxis, who no longer have jobs because Uber comes in and can take over. That's genuine disruption. That's replacement, right? But if you look at a business like OpenTable that was sold for whatever, $3 billion to Priceline, OpenTable is a fixing business, right? You're taking an existing process and you're trying to get people to do it in a new and better way. And so you're using technology, but that takes time. And it took them 10 years to get profitable as a business before they got to the place, you know, where they were worth what they were worth. And that really resonates with me because that is what we're doing. We're fixing an existing process. People buy these tickets already on Amtrak or here in the UK. There is a way to buy a ticket. You just have to know how to do it. But I think the other big thing that's being missed on is if you're an OTA and an American's flying into London and their aunt lives up in Manchester in the UK, if you go on to Travelocity is going to say, oh, the way you get from point A to point B is you get on this British Airways plane. And we all know, living in the UK, that the best way to get there is on a train, right? Way faster. You would never take an airplane between London and Manchester. So we all need for travel writ large to see rail integrated in with these air searches, so that we educate people about what the other options are. By the way, that it's 10 times cleaner than flying in a plane. I think it's incredibly important for society that these things happen, but it will take time. It will take time.
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, I just add on that the other challenge along with that is the carriers themselves. They do have to wake up to, if they want that to happen, if they want these fabulous OTAs to sell their products, they've got to offer some kind of an incentive. And some of them do, but the majority of them do not. And I think that's going to take time. And we've seen a tiny movement on the needle on that, but it's just going to take time for us to build credibility, get some volume going through, get the flywheel going. And, once we see it, and I remember this when I was running NLG, the first time we saw cruises up inside of Expedia, the rest of the travel industry were lemmings. Every single party fired up right after that. And the next thing you know, we had we had 4 times market share over anybody else that was retailing. The second somebody does something new, they all got to do it. And I think once we see one of them do a great job with rail, I think we'll see the rest of the market follow, but it'll take time.
Yeah.
So I loved your distinction between fixing a business and disrupting it. It reminds me of, I looked at the history of ITA software a while back, and there was some huge chunk of time before they got their first deal. I think it was something like 5 years, and then another year or two until they got their second deal. And it really, I've said this to our investors as well. It's like, the industries we operate in, often, these guys are operating on a 10 to 20 year timetable because you have to fix so many moving parts. So I think that's a great insight for our listeners. One thing I wanted to rewind a little bit. You mentioned kind of one of the big moments of change here was when you started pivoting and focusing on these IT platforms. So I think that's kind of an interesting point because it seemed almost as you have this big vision around GDS for rail, et cetera, but you realized that there was more budget in doing something much more specifically for those suppliers, and maybe instead of attacking the problem straight on, found another way to engage with these guys. So could you maybe expand a little bit on that and how that framing as an IT
Sure.
platform helps you, gain traction?
Yeah. So I think there are 3 things that we thought about here. One, if you look at the world, you're either consumer direct or you're B2B, right? And so we thought a lot about the consumer direct. In fact, we put a toe in the water in the consumer direct effort early on in the rail space. And the second year, we had launched a little website. We were doing a few tickets, but the kind of capital that's required to advertise inside of channels like Google. I mean, you just look at broadly, Expedia and Booking.com now, what is it, $6.4 billion a year they spend on that single channel. I mean, it's an astonishing amount of money. So to get airtime, consumer direct is super tough, which is, I think, why we are seeing less and less of sort of new entrants and new startups in the consumer space. It's because of this Google chokehold, and which I think is a fundamental problem for all of us. So we really did focus on the B2B side, but even within B2B, if you think about how B2B and distribution works, there are kind of 2 sides to it. There's distribution, which is where we started with, and then there's the actual IT spend that any carrier spends. And I was actually really fascinated by Amadeus's model. I mean, Amadeus is the only company that successfully does distribution on the air side, but then they also build the supplier's IT systems, and they power British Airways and a bunch of others. And that's what makes them worth $30 billion today, 5 times the value of the next largest company, Sabre. And as anybody at Amadeus will tell you, Sabre always had the bigger, better platform. But Amadeus just ran circles around them from an invention side, and in particular, having built this 2-sided model of distribution and IT. And my view was, well, I think we should be doing the same thing, thinking about the IT of the rail space, because you can build, really stable revenue bases while we take time to get the flywheel going on this GDS business, which I think is going to take us, honestly, another 10 years before we kind of see it up to full run rate. So even to your point, David, it's a 20-year horizon to make that happen. But IT, they spend money every year on IT, and you're competing against people like IBM, and yeah, they're big, but they don't actually build products really for the rail space. And we're one of the few parties that actually does. And that's enabled us to win more than our fair share of deals in that space. And that's become a pretty substantial business. But even there, you're kind of just doing a better job of what people were already doing. So I'm still almost, really excited about what we can do on the distribution side someday. That's the big blank piece of paper, if you will. And I really want to get that side to work. I'll be heartbroken if we can't make that piece of the business work. But fortunately, we can fall back on a very profitable IT business in the interim. And to your question, Kevin, that is how we've kind of threaded the needle here. I was like, okay, can we get to profitability and build a good, stable business that enables us to feed the other beast? And that's exactly how we've looked at it. And so far, we've been reasonably successful with it.
Okay. I feel like you answered part of the question I was about to ask, but I'll ask it anyways here. So I think at face value, there doesn't seem to be a lot of fragmentation in the rail industry, meaning other than the UK, often, the entire of the United States is Amtrak, right? There's often one major rail line per country. And I know that's starting to change, but I definitely, Mozio aggregates a little bit of rail, and I've heard people kind of getting into the rail game say that, oh, well, why would we go to a middleman? Like, it's just there's one per country. That's not such a big fragmentation challenge. Obviously, I think part of the answer is what you were talking about, focusing on all these very specific IT problems. But I'm also curious, kind of maybe if you can speak to how that's deceiving. Maybe it's much more fragmented and much more complex, and why that's a kind of false assumption.
Yeah, to your point, on the one hand, right, France is one country and it's monolithic, and you do a deal with one supplier and you're there. But then go to Germany, you're doing a deal with a completely different supplier, has a completely separate IT system. You got to figure them both out. And by the way, when we connected into Germany, we did it in 5 months, and they told us they'd never seen anyone get that done in less than a year and a half. Even Google, when they did it to integrate rail data into their search engines, and that was just the data side of it, it took them well over a year to figure out how to get that one market to work. So these things are just very, very different. You're talking about homegrown systems with completely different rules, and they just grew up in completely different ways. And what you call a child in Germany is a completely different thing than what you call a child in France. Maybe one stops at 14 years and the other stops at 10 years, right? So you got to figure out what's a child, what's a senior. These just very basic rules are challenging for distribution companies to do, unless, of course, you just want to sell in one market. You only want to sell in the UK, that's not that hard to figure out. You can figure out how to sell just in the UK, but you want that to be integrated in with any other product. That's a tougher game.
If I can, it sounds almost kind of like the while there might be a fourth or a fifth as many rail lines as there are airlines, because of the work you alluded to at the beginning with IATA and all the standardization, the problem's actually 4 to 5 times harder. So that kind of makes up for it.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's way more complicated at the end of the day. And I'll admit, like, the thing we're also surprised by is the amount of maintenance those systems take. And everyone talks about this in the space. You can say, oh yeah, it's not that hard to connect to France, but they're changing promotions constantly, pricing constantly, rules constantly, routes even on a pretty regular basis, introducing a new high-speed train here. And to keep up with that kind of change, man, that takes a lot of energy. And we often see that as the biggest complaint that partners will have is, wow, this takes a lot of juice to just stay up on top of this. The other thing that people tend to complain about, especially the agency side, so I was just having this conversation with one of the key people at American Express, and they were saying, it's not so much about the connection and the content. Like, we can make a connection. It's the fact that these rail systems, they require us to have dedicated call centers with dedicated trained agents who understand how to book exactly that kind of product. And then we got to integrate it in with the rest of the P&R. And then, God forbid, if somebody calls in to cancel it, we got to have a person on the phone again. That very little of this is actually automated in the back end, which is where we put a lot of work, is about how to create real efficiencies in these booking processes. But it's literally one of the most expensive products that any large agency can sell. And it's often a back end problem. And people don't, to your point, you don't really think about that in the early days. You're like, oh yeah, I'll just make that connection, no problem, we're good. and then you got to live with it.
Yeah, like it's funny. We have a deal with a big TMC, and there's a similar dynamic where it's not just about the connection to the ground transportation operator; it's the pushing of the PNR, the various travel records, the expensing systems, and stuff like that. And it's the everything. It's not even the ground transportation; it's everything around the ground transportation. So I feel your pain.
Yeah. And you know, it's interesting. We still haven't seen, even after we've done this, we haven't seen another company really funded and launched in this space since we got into it. You know, I guess that's a blessing and a curse. You love to see a couple of people taking a crack at it. The only other people that are really taking a crack at it are people like Trainline. But Trainline was a spin out of one of the rail carriers, so it wasn't kind of from the ground up. I mean, they started off running pretty fast. And there just aren't that many businesses that are doing this stuff. There's a company out of the Netherlands, Skills, which is a fabulous business. I really admire what those guys are doing. Again, real carrier IT, custom built for these guys. They've done a bunch of really good work in the space, but it's just a couple. You know, there just hasn't been much more beyond. You know, after we came in. But on the positive side, you know, once you get these deals, especially the distribution deals, you know, they're pretty high barriers for people switching away. And that's the strength of the model, right? You're essentially kind of creating a recurring revenue model over time, and that makes the business really stable.
Tell me, Aaron, I was going to ask you some things about your fundraising strategy, but beforehand,
yeah.
I mean, you're in a fairly unique position as a travel and transportation startup in that you've probably had to deal with a lot of government-owned, state-owned companies, perhaps more than other startups. So how did you find that? Because some may at least assume that working with state-owned organizations is another headache in itself entirely.
Yeah, it can be. It can be. I'm kind of laughing because I remember saying to the board, they were like, and this is in the early days, they're like, Aaron, why is this taking so long? And I said, you got to realize, in a commercial business like our last one, when you send an email to somebody, you hear back in 2 days. I said, but in this space, it's 2 weeks. You know, I think rail carriers are working on way different timelines. You know, they got, talk about SNCF, right? You got strikes happening in France. You send them an email, you're not going to hear back for a while, right? They got big social pressures on them to perform and get those trains running. And I, you know, again, using this word, I have a huge amount of empathy for their problem. You know, just thinking about new distribution channels, getting their stuff online, up inside of Expedia. Yeah, that's priority 50 on their list. So I was surprised at how slow this space has moved.
Yeah.
And it's taken us a long time, honestly, to build credibility. You know, I said earlier on, you know, I moved almost immediately over to London, and it was because it was interesting in talking to these carriers. They're like, well, look, we like the fact that you're an American company because American tech companies actually get stuff done. But they said, but are you really committed here? Are you really going to be here in 5 years? Or are you going to flame out or go away or sell or whatever? And so I realized that this was going to be a problem. So 1 year after starting the company, I moved to London full-time just to solve this credibility problem. And at least I was able to say to people, hey, I live here. You know, I'm committed to this market. I'm going to make this work. And it just took a long time to build credibility with these suppliers who are very skeptical. And to your question, Kevin, they'd seen a lot of people come in and promise before, right? They'd seen Amadeus promise a lot, Sabre promise a lot, other companies. And so one of our big things has just been like, all right, don't over push, just teach these guys, let's build some credibility, you know, just tick it over again and again and again and do what we say we're going to do. And I do think, like, if I was going to say one of the things I'm really proud of is, like, when we say we're going to build something as a company, like, we do it. We hit the timelines. We just finished a major project connecting SNCF into Agencia, Expedia's corporate arm. And we hit all of the dates all the way through, didn't miss anything. And that built a lot of credibility both with Agencia and with SNCF. And SNCF hadn't seen that before. And so that made us feel really good that we could be at least do what we said we were going to do.
Okay.
And then.
Okay, so I suppose around the building credibility slogan then, I mean, you raised somewhere in the region of around 70 million over the course of 8 years or so. I think 40 million was the biggest one, 2014. What was your approach to raising money? Were you just taking what was being offered, or were you going out with specific, we need X amount? And back to the question. Back to the question.
Yeah.
Did you find that it was tough to get credibility for what you were doing, given that perhaps not a lot of people understood what it was about?
Okay, so I'll rewind just a tiny bit before SilverRail. So my last business, NLG, had raised a couple $100 million through the course of its life. And this is the funny thing. My Series A at NLG in April of 2000, which was about 20 days before the market crashed, the Series A was $82 million, because you just couldn't ask for enough money before the stock market crashed in 2000. Like, SoftBank came in as a big supporter, and they said, we won't even touch this unless we can write a $50 million check. And I was like, sure, you can write a $50 million check. Yeah, so they backed the business. General Catalyst backed the business, and $82 million Series A. Fast forward, and that was easy to do. Fast forward, after the stock market crash in 2009 and the markets were at the bottom, I went through, I have the list still, I think I met 32 venture firms before I could get to 2 serious yeses and raise $6 million. So this is like 8 years later. It was brutal in those days to raise money. It was really, really tough. I think I was fortunate because I had built a previous business, and much of the intellectual idea about bringing a product that wasn't being exposed to consumers and getting that online, like, I knew how to do that part. And so I think I got credit for that. I definitely knew how the VCs thought. I was very fortunate. You know, my previous life, my first job out of university was at Bain & Company, and I helped them start their private equity consulting practice. And from there, I jumped over to venture capital, and I was General Catalyst's first employee back in, what year was that? That was 98. And so I at least understood how these guys thought about investment, and I understood the lingo. And so I had a little bit of experience from NLG, and I had a little bit of experience in raising capital. So I was able to get the flywheel going. I think the other thing, and I think entrepreneurs don't think enough about this, is just the size of the space, right? So when you talk about a $300 billion market and no one's doing it well, VCs go, that's interesting. And, you know, as they looked around, there weren't any other people doing this. And as one of our investors, Sonali DeRiker at Excel, who's a fabulous investor here in London, she said to me, she goes, you know, Aaron, I don't know if your guys are going to make it. She goes, but here's what I know. It's a $300 billion market, and you're the only one taking a crack at it. She goes, because when I look at social media, I'm looking at 6 apps. I have no idea which one of these guys is going to make it and which ones are going to flame out. A whole bunch of them are going to flame out, but I can't tell. And she goes, so I just make bets. And she goes, but at least on you, I'm making a bet on the only company that's trying to figure this out. And she goes, so maybe, just maybe, you'll make it. And I thought, well, that's a pretty rational argument about kind of size of space and the number of competitors. And so to that your question, Kevin, it was a little bit about, you know, the dynamics. The dynamics are very important to think about when trying to raise capital, because I didn't have any experience in the rail space, to be honest. And so it really was a true venture bet of like, if we back this guy, can he actually do what he says he's going to do? And it took a long time. And frankly, you know, we were like, oh yeah, on 6 million, we're going to be profitable in that second year. And, you know, we burnt through all of that money. And then we went out and said, okay, if you just give me 15 million more, I'll definitely be profitable on that 15 million. And then you burn all the way through that. And then you get to the other side and you're like, okay, if you just give me 40, I'll definitely be profitable. And so you're always playing this, you know, not game, but it's definitely a real challenge. But the thing, again, that we always had going for us was the things that were in our control, like our ability to build product. We did what we said we would do. The team, we built the team we said we could build. We attracted really good talent. A lot of the ex-ITA people, in fact, are still here. So they really understood a lot of the space, at least from the air side. And we just had investors who were like, okay, if somebody's going to is going to make progress here and get the deal done, it's likely to be Aaron and gang. And so we kept getting, backing all the way through. And in fact, when we ultimately sold 75%, roughly, about 75% of the business to Expedia, not one of the investors wanted to sell the company, even though we were in the beginning phases of needing to raise a pretty sizable Series D. Not one of them. In fact, in a couple of places, it was a pretty tough fight and a tough argument to get the deal done. But the reason that I pushed it so hard, I said, guys, you're fabulous investors. I love you guys, but this is strategically, this is Expedia's turf, and they have the ability, if they really get behind rail, just like they did in the prior business around cruise, they can really blow this out over time. And secondly, they bring a lot of strategic value to us in terms of, technology and other places where they can really help us out around AWS. And there's a lot to be said as businesses get bigger to get real strategic partners behind you. And that's worked out really well for us. Although, I'm still a little bit sad about booting out all the VCs.
So quick follow-up question. So you said, you had to go through, 32 VC firms before you got to 2 serious yeses. I'd be curious to hear what the big issue was. And specifically, if you think that VCs prioritize quote unquote disruption businesses over fix-it businesses, kind of like we were talking about before, and was that an issue since a 15 to 20 year timetable sometimes scares people away?
Yeah, that's a fair question. I mean, it does go a lot to the fit of the investors. So our Series A was led by a firm called Sutter Hill Ventures out of Palo Alto, and a partner there who's to this day the best VC I've ever worked with, a guy named Jim White. Sutter Hill is an evergreen fund, and an evergreen fund never has to return capital back to its investors, meaning it's been around for a long time. Their whole thing is to invest in companies for very long time horizons. I do think, as an aside, that a lot of folks that are trying to raise money earlier on don't think enough about who the VC is, the individual VC, and where the state of the fund is. Because if you're in, the middle of a second fund that on a 7-year horizon is already halfway in, they're going to start pushing for an exit, 3 years out. Where Sutter Hill had a company that they've held for 40 years, and they still had the stock. This was the first money. These guys were some of the first money in Apple, some of the first money in Hewlett Packard back in the day. And because of that, and because of the problem that we were tackling, they were like, this is a macro industry changing problem if Aaron can solve this. And so we had a lot of support from that point of view. And frankly, once Jim was on board, he's considered one of the best investors in Silicon Valley. It made it a lot easier to raise the rest of the money. And the quality of the money really matters here. I spent a lot of time thinking about, does this venture firm have experience in this space or a related space? I think often, one of the most important things for people when they look at venture firms is, what's the analogy that will resonate with a particular partner? So if someone's done something in maybe not even travel, but a space where somebody built a platform that aggregated content and fixed a distribution problem, you can then make analogies to a successful exit that they had. And that resonates with people. Like, they get that quickly, and you'll get the meetings, and often you'll get the investment. But if you walk into an investor where they know nothing about your space and they're really squinting hard to understand what you're doing, you're done. Even if they're like, yeah, we really like it, it's really interesting, you'll never get to a close with those guys.
Yeah, what's interesting is
I think that's a really important.
Yeah, one of Mozio's investors is actually the founder of Braintree, and we actually at one point had a slide calling ourselves like the Braintree or Stripe for ground transportation, and he obviously got it and put money. So it was obviously he didn't do anything in transportation or travel, but he understood aggregating large systems and stuff like that. So I know.
Yeah.
Go on. Sorry.
Yeah. The other secret weapon I had in fundraising was the power of my best friend Brad Gerstner, and so. Brad Gerstner, who's the CEO of Altimeter Capital now, he was my co-CEO at NLG, and we basically built that business together. And Brad just knows, he's invested in everything now. He's got over $3 billion invested in a bunch of different stuff, but primarily the travel space. And he knows everybody. And he introduced me to Jim because they were on a board together. So over time, these relationships, they do help.
So Aaron, I mean, I'm very conscious of our listeners and your time here, but I think we haven't even got to the, I guess, the most recent, or not the most recent, but everything that kind of started happening 2 or 3 years ago, and that was the deal with the Expedia Group. I mean, just tell us briefly, how did that come about? Did they approach you? Did you approach them? I mean, you talked.
Sure.
You referenced a bit about how you had those interesting conversations with your investors, but how did it start coming about with Expedia? And then I've got another one to follow up.
So I told the story earlier about how I called Dara Khosrowshahi and asked him about how they were thinking about rail. And this was when he was early on in his CEO role at Expedia, and he'd been at IAC before that as an investor for Barry. And so I call him and I'm like, hey, look, I'm going to raise $6 million. This is what I'm thinking about. Is this a good idea? Because I really wasn't sure. I was like, is this going to fly? And he's like, yeah, it is a really good idea. 2 days later, he called me back. He said, look, Aaron, I've been talking to Barry about this. We really like what you're doing. We'd like to fund your entire Series A. And I was like, oh, that's amazing. I'm like, wait a minute. That means I'm going to work for you. And he's like, well, I'm sure we can figure something out. I said, you know what? I really appreciate that, Dara. I mean, it's incredibly flattering. You've been such a big supporter. I said, but I'd really like to take a crack at this on my own first before you guys buy the business. And so the funny thing is that's what we were talking about, 8 years earlier. And fast forward, when I was beginning to raise the Series D, and we had a deal with their Agencia division, and we were talking about a big strategic deal with Expedia. I said, hey, Dara, just FYI, I'm going to be raising some money here. And I want you to know what I'm up to because, you're a customer and we want to make sure you understand what's happening. And it's really important. He said, and he's like, hey, can you come out and walk me through it? So I walked them through it, and they were like, he and Mark Okerstrom, Mark's now the CEO. Mark was the one who was like, I think we should really do this and we should acquire this business and really support Aaron through this. So they did. And they've got a history here and a really interesting model where they acquire essentially the shares from the venture people or the other investors, and then they keep that entity exactly the same as it is, and they leave it alone roughly. And they did this with TripAdvisor, took it private, and then 3-4 years later, they spun it back out as a public company, and they just did this with Trivago. And this is a playbook they've been running for a number of years, because if you think about it, Dara's background with Barry, they're really an investment firm. That's a deal company, and they look at things. And I think, I remember, Dara had kind of two his thesis around this had two kind of key points. One was this frequency argument, right? And he's like, rail matters here, and people use it a lot, and there aren't many other things out there that are doing what they're doing. And the second thing is, because he was seeing all of this money being spent on Google and the competition around that, and nobody knew what that was going to mean for the margins in the business, I think he was looking at what we were doing and saying, these guys have a pretty secure position. They don't have to spend marketing money. They have a really solid foothold here in this rail space with, deep recurring revenue, long-term contracts. Some of the contracts are, 12 years long, and no marketing spend. So once you build the product, it's a recurring model. And I think he found that the different kind of a model, almost as a hedge against the ad model where you have to spend so much marketing money to acquire the next customer.
It's interesting though.
That's how I looked at it.
Yeah, I mean, did you ever think as you were going through those 7 or 8 years that you would end up selling to an OTA, which is one of your customers, rather than perhaps the one that us in the media would have thought that you would have ended up selling to one of the GDSs, for example?
Yeah, that's it. I would not have said it would end up with an OTA. I did think that Expedia might do it because Dara really got it. He really liked it. And at the end of the day, a lot of this is about what the CEO likes or doesn't like, right? And what they find attractive. And relatively in Expedia's world, we were a tiny acquisition. And so I think the personal dynamic was a key thing here with those guys. I don't think we could have done this with another OTA. I just didn't love what the GDS were doing. I wasn't impressed with the efforts I was seeing there. Amadeus has taken almost all their investment out of the rail space over time to focus on where the money is, on the hotel space. And so, you never want to be inside of a business where you're not strategic, where somebody's not really supporting you. And I was pretty scared off by that. And the only other path I actually really thought, and I still think this, that in the rail space, it makes sense for someone like us to be independent and to be a separate public company. Whether that's on our own or as a roll-up of some other stuff that's public, like that would make a lot of sense to me. Have some true independence so that the rail carriers can say, okay, you really are working in our best interests. You don't have a particular angle where you're trying to support some other business like Air with Amadeus. I think that could have done us a lot of damage, frankly, had we done a deal with someone like them.
Okay.
So Expedia was kind of the best model that we saw of them just leaving stuff alone and keeping it independent.
Okay. I've got one more. I'll leave David to see if he has any more. But it's an interesting one. I've seen this referenced in many times on your biographies, and it's frankly a fairly short, pithy question, Aaron, which I'm rather good at. But a lot has been made of your army career and throwing yourself out of airplanes, things like that. I mean, just tell me. I mean, is there anything? I suspect you're going to say teamwork or something like that. But is there anything from that part of your career that you've kind of held true as a kind of a business ethic all the way through the startups that you've done?
Yeah, there is. I actually think about this a lot. One of the things that happened, so part of what, Kevin, you're referencing is I was in the 82nd Airborne, which is a sort of elite parachute unit, and we were credited with the lowest combat jump in military history into combat. But I was always fascinated by these what were essentially smaller units and why they could be so successful. And a lot of that had to do with, you spend a lot of time preparing and thinking about strategy and making sure everyone was really aligned and rowing in the exact same direction. The second thing you did was you made sure the quality of the people were of a certain caliber and that, you could really count on them. And the third thing was you really started, and this is very true for me, like when we were in combat and things, you really start to pay attention to what really matters and what doesn't matter. And I think it's so easy to get distracted, but the reality is if I do this, then I can do this, and then I can get to here. And those are the 3 steps that have to happen. And I have gotten maniacal about understanding, like, what are the couple of things, if that customer goes live and they're a raving success and they're raving about SilverRail, that will get the next one going. And so I've taken very specific points and said, it's this has to occur in this way. And the military is very much like that. They're very thoughtful about, okay, you have to get to here and then to here and then to here. And then obviously putting lots of energy into it. But that's really seen me through a lot of this.
Okay.
Very cool. Yeah. I think that's
guys, that was fun.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for spending the time with us, Aaron. I appreciate it. And we'll let you go. And looking forward to more conversations like this. The podcast is
thanks, guys.
PhocusWire together.
Well, look, I also want to give this a plug. I think it's super important that you're doing this. You know, we don't have a lot of ways to really spread information. I think podcasts are just one of the all-time greatest inventions to really tap into people's brains and listen to how they built stuff. So I'm so glad you guys are doing this for the travel space, in particular to help all these other startups out there. So thanks for doing it.
Of course.
All right. Take care, guys.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to the How I Got Here podcast. We'll be back next week with more inside stories behind startups and innovation in travel and transportation. Check mozio.com/move for a complete write-up of the highlights of every podcast with translations into 5 languages. And get your daily dose of news on the digital travel economy by subscribing to the newsletter at PhocusWire.com. See you next week.